October 20th, 1968. A Greek island. A wedding. Radziwill is standing at the edge of the reception in something exquisite. She was always in something exquisite, and she is smiling. She is holding flowers. She is the matron of honor. The groom is Aristotle Onassis. Radziwill had been in love with him first. She had carried the affair in secret for 5 years, suppressed it on command, surrendered it without acknowledgement, never named it publicly. And now she was watching her sister marry him, in a dress that cost more than most people earned in a year. Smiling. What Radziwill was carrying that day on Scorpios was not visible. It never had been. It had been accumulating since she was 17 years old, built layer by layer, weight by weight, by the people who needed her to hold it so they would not have to. Nobody asked her to put it down. Nobody ever had. She carried it alone. Old Money Tragedy shows exactly what it was. Subscribe so the weight is finally named. Radziwill was born Caroline Lee Bouvier on March 3, 1933, in Southampton, New York, 4 years behind her sister Jacqueline, and 3 years ahead of a world that would spend the rest of her life measuring her against someone else. But before that world arrived, she was simply someone. And the someone she was, before the weight found her, is worth staying with, because what was taken from Radziwill can only be understood by first understanding what she actually had. Those who knew both Bouvier sisters in the 1940s and early 1950s were consistent about one thing. Lee was the one who stopped rooms. Not Jackie. Truman Capote, who knew them both as well as anyone alive and had no particular incentive to be diplomatic, said it plainly in 1976. She's all the things people give Jackie credit for. All the looks, style, taste. Jackie never had them at all. And yet it was Lee who lived in the shadow of this super-something person. He wasn't being cruel about Jackie. He was being accurate, about Lee. She had dark-set eyes and high cheekbones and a husky voice that arrived in a room before she did. She had what designers and artists who worked with her for decades would consistently describe as a genuine eye. Not trained taste, not absorbed sophistication, but original intelligence about how things looked and why. She would eventually work with Renzo Mongiardino, the Italian stage designer who was one of the most sought-after decorators of the post-war period, producing interiors so admired they were photographed and published repeatedly through the 1960s and 1970s. Giorgio Armani, who hired her as a public relations executive and became a close friend, said she could walk into any event and dissolve the tension before anyone knew it had existed. "I almost had the impression I was not working," Armani said, "because of the understanding between us. This was not performed charm. It was an actual quality. Something she had been born with and had quietly developed, in the margins of a childhood that was not arranged for her development." The Bouvier household was elegant and unstable in equal measure. Their father, John Blackjack Bouvier, was a stockbroker with a gift for spending and a weakness for other women. Their mother, Janet Norton Lee, was a social strategist who understood the mechanics of their world with ruthless clarity. The family lived well, then badly, then managed summer estates, horses, elite schools, a social position that required constant maintenance and produced constant anxiety. When Janet finally divorced Blackjack and married the wealthy Hugh D. Auchincloss, the girls were absorbed into a new kind of stability, with new half-siblings and a stepfather who provided what their father had not. Both daughters attended Miss Porter's school in Connecticut. Both were beautiful. Both were trained, not in any classroom, but in every corridor and dinner table of their upbringing, to understand that a woman's permanent security was built through the right marriage, not through what she built herself, through whom she married. Lee understood this instruction and made a private decision, somewhere in her adolescence, to work with it while building something else alongside. She would do what was required. She would also keep developing the thing that was actually hers. The first weight was placed in 1947, when Lee was 14 and her sister was 18. That year, Jacqueline Bouvier had her coming-out ball. In the social world they occupied, a coming-out ball was a formal declaration. This young woman is available, she is of the right class, the right training has been applied. Igor Cassini, the Society columnist, declared Jackie debutante of the year. The language around her was immediate and emphatic. The conclusion was made in one evening. Lee attended. She wore a bright pink dress covered in rhinestones, not the cream-colored gown that every other young woman at such an occasion wore by convention. People noticed. They concluded she was being competitive, trying to draw attention away from her sister on Jackie's night. Maybe, or maybe it was simpler than that. A 14-year-old girl had watched the world turn its full attention toward her sister, and had understood, in the wordless way adolescents understand the rules of the systems they're trapped in, that if she wore cream, she would be invisible. So she wore pink. She would have to do something unusual to be seen at all. What was placed on Lee Bouvier in 1947 was not a weight she could identify or name. It arrived without announcement. It was this: from this point forward, she would not be measured against her own potential. She would be measured against her sister. Every room she entered, every career she attempted, every man she loved, the standard would be Jacqueline. Not because Jackie was cruel, not because their mother intended it precisely, because the culture around them had selected its subject, and Lee was not it. She accepted the comparison the way you accept weather. She was 14. She believed, as people that age are still permitted to believe, that life would eventually make its own case. She accepted it. She had no reason not to. She did not yet understand that accepting the first weight made the second one easier to place. 3 people loaded Lee Radziwill. None of them named what they were doing. The first was Janet. Janet Norton Lee Auchincloss placed the foundational weight, and she placed it with love, which is what made it so permanent. The weight Janet gave her daughters was not a punishment. It was the operating manual for their world. A woman secures her life through the man she marries. Beauty and style are capital, not decoration. The family name is the first credential. What a woman builds for herself is optional. What she marries is structural. Janet delivered this to both daughters without distinction. She believed it completely. It had worked for her. She had no reason to think it would work differently for Lee. But it did work differently because of what happened to Jackie. Jackie received the same instruction and found, through the specific accident of marrying John F. Kennedy at exactly the right moment in American political history, that the instruction had been transformed by circumstance into something it had never been designed to produce. Her marriage didn't just secure her life. It made her a historical figure. The weight Janet had placed on her became, through sheer luck of timing, something that looked like destiny. Lee followed the same instruction and got the same result the instruction was actually designed to produce. A title, a wealthy husband, a position. In 1959, she married Prince Stanislav Albrecht Radziwill and became, in the most literal sense, a princess. She had done exactly what her mother told her to do. Jackie got history. Lee got a title that would never be enough, in a world that had already decided what enough looked like. The second person who loaded Lee was Stas Radziwill himself. He was charming. He was titled. He was significantly older. He was also, according to accounts from the period, unfaithful in the sustained and unapologetic way that men of his class and generation considered their prerogative. Lee married him pregnant. Their son Anthony was born in Switzerland 5 months after the March 1959 wedding. Their daughter Anna Christina followed in 1960, with President Kennedy himself serving as godfather. By the time the marriage had settled into its permanent shape, it was not a partnership. It was a performance Lee gave every day, in beautiful homes, in exquisite clothes, for the benefit of a world that admired the staging and never asked what it cost the performer. She described it herself. In a McCall's magazine interview with Gloria Steinem, conducted during the Kennedy White House years, Lee said her life during that period was empty, cold, and not true. She said this quietly. The quote was printed. Nobody followed up. Nobody asked what she meant or what she would have preferred instead. The interview moved on. The world moved on. Nobody asked her what she meant. She called it her life. Stas called it their marriage. They were not describing the same thing. The third person who loaded Lee was not a person at all. It was a date. January 20th, 1961. The inauguration of John F. Kennedy as President of the United States. Lee did not attend. According to family accounts, she refused. Her brother-in-law was now the most powerful man in the world. Her sister was now, permanently, institutionally, in the formal record of history, the First Lady of the United States. Lee Radziwill was a princess. In any other context, in any other family, this would have been more than sufficient. This would have been the story. She was already carrying the comparison from 1947, 14 years of being measured against Jackie before Jackie had become anything more than a socialite with a gift for public presentation. She was already carrying a marriage she had described as empty and cold. And now the measuring stick had been elevated to a height it would never come down from. What was loaded onto Lee at Jackie's ascension was something the people around her never named and the culture around her never examined. The permanent designation of secondary. Not the junior partner. The second name. Always and specifically the second name. The sister of the First Lady. Then the sister of the widow. Then the sister of Jackie Kennedy Onassis. The sentence always contained Jackie first. Lee was the clause that followed. She carried this so Jackie would not have to consider it. That was the arrangement. It required no conversation. It needed no signature. It was simply what happened when one woman's life was assigned the role of context for another woman's story. Carry one weight long enough and you stop noticing it. That is what the body does with chronic load. It adjusts. It reorganizes. It builds the weight into the structure of how you move, so that carrying it stops feeling like carrying and starts feeling like simply being. Lee Radziwill carried the comparison for 14 years before the second weight arrived. By 1961, it was so built into her posture, her social posture, the way she introduced herself, the way she navigated rooms, that she may not have registered it as external at all. It had become internal. The measuring stick was no longer being held by someone else. She was holding it herself. The second weight, Jackie's ascension to First Lady, arrived not as a single blow but as a slow, permanent elevation. And what the elevation did was make every existing weight heavier. The informal comparison between sisters had become a national institution. Lee was now not just in her sister's shadow. She was in the shadow of an image, the First Lady of the United States, photographed in Givenchy, which Lee helped smuggle past JFK's American designer's only rule. Adored by a global press that had decided Jackie was the story of their era. The press's relationship with Lee during the Kennedy years tells the whole story in miniature. Journalists didn't report on what Lee was doing. They reported on Lee as a satellite of Jackie, what she thought of the White House renovations, what she wore to which event, how she compared. Lee's own design work, her homes, her genuine friendships with artists and writers, her original aesthetic intelligence. None of this was the story the press wanted from her. The story they wanted was, how does it feel to be her sister? She answered those questions. She answered them gracefully, in the deflecting, polished way she had learned to manage every surface that the world pointed at her. She said the talk of rivalry was the most ludicrous thing in the world. She said Jackie and she were close, that their bond was real, that she was proud of her sister. She said all of this. None of it was untrue. None of it was the whole truth either. The whole truth was what she told Truman Capote. She met Capote in 1962, and the friendship that developed between them was the most honest relationship of Lee's adult life. Honest in the specific sense that she told him what she could not tell anyone else. According to those close to both of them, Lee told Capote that she was wildly jealous of Jackie, that the jealousy was not occasional or petty but deep and sustained and impossible to discharge, because its source was not something Jackie had done. Its source was what had been done to Lee, through the simple mechanism of declaring Jackie the subject of the story and Lee the footnote. Capote understood. He also could not fix it. He could only hold the secret, which he did until he didn't. Then, in the spring and summer of 1963, something changed. Something she had not been expecting. Lee began an affair with Aristotle Onassis. He was 56 years old. He owned a shipping empire, an airline, substantial real estate and oil interests. He had an ongoing relationship with opera singer Maria Callas. Not secret, largely accepted in the European world he and Lee both inhabited. By the standards of their world, his availability was a matter of degree and negotiation rather than a binary condition. What was not standard was how Lee felt about him. This was not a strategic alliance, not a move in a social game, By the accounts of Truman Capote, who heard it directly from Lee, she was genuinely in love with Onassis. The affair began on a cruise in the spring of 1963 and deepened through that summer. For the first time in a decade, perhaps for the first time since she understood what her life was actually made of, Lee Radziwill felt like the subject of her own story. The primary person in the room. Not Jackie's sister. Not Stas's princess. Not the secondary clause in someone else's biography. Then Robert Kennedy intervened. The U.S. Attorney General, her brother-in-law, Jackie's husband's brother, did not approve of Onassis. Onassis had been indicted by the U.S. government for fraud. RFK considered him a dangerous association for the Kennedy administration in the lead-up to what should have been an easy 1964 re-election. When the affair surfaced in the American press during the summer of 1963, it became a political problem. Through channels that did not require direct conversation, the message was delivered to Lee. Cool it. Stop. For the administration. For Jackie. She did. She stayed in the marriage she had described as empty and cold and not true. She withdrew from Onassis. She protected the image of a family that had, in the counting that mattered, made her secondary without acknowledgement or apology. And she carried this, the suppression of the one thing she had wanted for herself, without public acknowledgement, without anyone noting the sacrifice, without any reciprocal protection from the people she had protected. Then it was November 22nd, 1963. Lee flew from London to Washington within hours of the assassination. She was at Bethesda Naval Hospital when the president's body arrived. She went to the White House. She sat with Jackie. She left a note on Jackie's pillow the night of the funeral. It said, according to those who saw it, "Good night, my darling Jax, the bravest and noblest of all." She meant every word. She helped Jackie move out of the White House. She helped her find a new apartment in New York. She stayed until Jackie was stable, until the structure of a new life had been at least provisionally assembled. She did all of this because she loved her sister completely, and she did it while still carrying everything she had been carrying. The comparison, the cold marriage, the suppressed love, now the grief too. The weight had grown in the years since 1947. It had grown in the incremental, almost invisible way that chronic weight grows. Not a sudden addition but a gradual settling, each layer compressing the ones beneath it. By late 1963, Lee Radziwill was carrying something that had taken 16 years to build, and she had carried it long enough that what it had done to her posture, her social posture, the particular quality of controlled surface she presented to the world, had stopped being visible as carrying. It looked like composure. It looked like grace. The weight remained. When you open the first weight, the one placed in 1947, the one that said Lee would always be the second name, what is inside is not a wound. It is a theft. Lee Radziwill was not lacking an identity. She had one. Original, specific, genuinely hers. The eye that noticed a room's proportions and corrected them instinctively. The warmth that Armani described as dissolving tension before anyone registered it was there. The wit that Capote, who collected brilliant people the way others collected art, found exceptional. The aesthetic intelligence that produced homes Mongiardino wanted to be photographed, that produced interiors Publi's head in the significant design journals of the 1960s and 1970s, that produced environments people walked into and immediately felt were right. None of this was given to her by Jackie. None of it was reflected from her sister. It was her own. And what the first weight contained, what was specifically packed inside it, was a mechanism that took this original identity and converted it in every public arena into a supporting role. Not through malice. Through the simple structural fact that the press, the social world, and eventually the historical record all understood Lee Radziwill through one lens, the sister of Jacqueline Kennedy. When Lee performed in the Philadelphia Story at Chicago's Ivanhoe Theater in 1967, Truman Capote had pushed her toward it, genuinely believing in her capacity. The show sold out. The reviews were merciless. Not about her performance as Tracy Lord, the spoiled mainline heiress at the play's center. About her presence as a celebrity, as a socialite, as Jackie Kennedy's sister attempting something she had no business attempting. She wore a wardrobe by Yves Saint Laurent. The critics noted the clothes before they noted the performance. Jackie was conveniently abroad for the entire run. so the audience arriving to compare the sisters to see how Lee measured up had only Lee to look at. What the critics were really reviewing was not Lee Radziwill the actress. It was the category error of a woman the world had designated as context trying to be content. A year later, Capote wrote a television adaptation of the Hollywood film Laura specifically for her. It was also badly received. She stopped pursuing acting after that. What was inside the first weight is now visible. Every time Lee Radziwill stood in front of an audience and tried to be seen as herself, the weight she had been carrying since 1947 walked on stage with her and stood between her and the room. The second weight, the Onassis weight, contained something more precise. She had been in love with him. She had suppressed the affair on instruction. She had protected the Kennedy administration's image at the cost of the one relationship in her adult life that had made her feel primary. She had done this without acknowledgement, without thanks, without any formal recognition that she had given something up. 5 years later, 5 years after the suppression, 5 years after Dallas, 5 years of widowhood for Jackie and 5 years of increasingly deteriorating marriage for Lee, Jackie married Onassis. Jackie did not tell their mother in advance. She did not tell Lee. Lee found out when Onassis called her personally to invite her to the wedding, which was scheduled for October 20, 1968, on his private island of Scorpios. Truman Capote received a call from Lee after the invitation. He described her as weeping. What she said, according to Capote, was, "How could she? How could this happen?" Then Lee Radziwill went to Scorpios. She served as matron of honor. She held flowers. She smiled. What was inside the second weight, what the Onassis theft contained, was not only the loss of a man. It was the confirmation of something Lee had been refusing to fully believe since 1947. That whatever she wanted or built or loved was not protected from reassignment. The life she was living was not quite hers to own. Her desires were available to be overridden by the same system that had made her secondary in the first place. The weight was not random. What was inside it was specific. Someone had packed it carefully. The third weight didn't arrive until May 19, 1994, when Jackie Kennedy Onassis died of cancer in New York. Lee had flown from wherever she was. She had been at her sister's side in the final days. She had loved Jackie imperfectly, as all real love is imperfect, and completely, as it also always was between them. She had been the one to rush to Washington when the president was shot. She had been the one who wrote the note on the pillow. She had been, across the length of their lives, a consistent presence when presence was required. When the will was read, it contained one sentence about Lee Radziwill. Verbatim, it said, "I have made no provision in this my will for my sister, Lee B. Radziwill, for whom I have great affection, because I have already done so during my lifetime." Lee received nothing, not a piece of jewelry, not a photograph, not a piece of furniture from the homes they had shared. The formal document that survived Jackie, the legal record of who had mattered to her, positioned Lee as a debt already discharged, a ledger already closed, someone who had been taken care of in the past sufficiently. Jackie had decided what Lee was owed. Jackie had decided when the debt was settled. Lee had no voice in either calculation. What the will revealed was not simply Jackie's coldness, though it revealed that too. It revealed the structural truth of the entire weight system. The arrangement had always been one-directional. Lee gave. Jackie received or took or simply existed in a way that made Lee's contributions invisible. The giving had never been mutual in the way it appeared from outside. Lee had given Onassis, pulled back from him, sacrificed him for the family's reputation. She had given 30 years of secondary billing. She had given her acting ambitions to a press that reviewed her through Jackie's mirror. And what the will returned to her, in Jackie's own legal language, was a sentence that said, "Already handled." The weight she placed on herself was silence. Publicly, consistently, across every interview she gave over 5 decades, Lee Radziwill denied that the dynamic between her and Jackie was anything other than love. She called the rivalry talk the most ludicrous thing in the world. She deflected, redirected, smiled. She performed the role of the gracious, unbothered, deeply loving younger sister who was perfectly at peace with her position in the story. She performed it because Nami, ing the weight was the one thing she could not do. To name it was to become the jealous sister, the difficult one, the one who couldn't accept her place. And that designation would have confirmed, publicly and permanently, everything she had spent her entire adult life refusing to confirm. So she carried the weight of silence about the weight, the meta-load, the performance of being unburdened. What it would have cost her to put the silence down is unknowable. What it actually produced was a woman who lived 85 years, outlived her sister by 25 of them, and died with the New York Times describing her, in the formal headline of her obituary, as the sister of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Not a princess, not a style icon, not a designer, a public figure, a woman of her own substance. The sister. Nobody named the weight while she was alive. I am naming it now. She had been carrying all of it, for longer than anyone had noticed. And inside each weight, someone had placed exactly what they needed her to hold so they would not have to. The first thing that changed was the direction she moved. Before 1963, before the Kennedy years locked the comparison into history, before the Onassis affair and its suppression, Lee Radziwill moved toward things. She had the quality of someone who understood that effort and original work would eventually be rewarded on their own terms. She pursued design with genuine seriousness. She built friendships in the artistic world that were not social climbing but actual creative kinship, with Warhol, with Nureyev, with Steinem. She made homes that would be admired for the next half-century. She was, in the fullest sense, building. By the late 1960s, that orientation had reversed. What anyone who had known Lee Radziwill in 1958 and seen her again in 1968 would have noticed was not what she had lost. They would have noticed the direction she was facing. In 1958, she faced forward, toward things she was going toward. In 1968, she faced inward, toward the management of what she already had to carry. She had stopped initiating. The acting career happened because Capote initiated it for her. The CBS interview program, 6 episodes of conversations with Lee Radziwill, commissioned in 1974, canceled before a full run, came because a network offered her the opportunity. The Armani work, which she did superbly from 1986 to 1994, was a position, not a project, not something she had reached for, something she had accepted. What she had been in 1958 was a woman building. What she had become by 1974 was a woman managing. Nobody connected the two things. The second thing that changed was trust, specifically her capacity to be known. Truman Capote was the relationship that made this visible. For over a decade, he had been the person Lee told things to that she told no one else. The jealousy, the loneliness inside the performance, the gap between the life she was living and the life she was carrying. He held these confidences with genuine care, for years, and the friendship they produced was the closest thing in Lee's adult life to being fully seen. It ended in 1977, and the way it ended reveals what the weight had done to her. In 1975, Capote gave an interview in which he told an exaggerated story about Gore Vidal at a 1961 White House party. Vidal sued. Capote asked Lee, who had also been at the party, to give an affidavit supporting his account. When Vidal's lawyers came to Lee, she gave a statement saying she did not recall the incident or the evening. She stopped taking Capote's calls after that. The friendship did not end because Lee was disloyal. She was not, by nature, a disloyal person. It ended because what a decade of carrying unreturned loyalty had produced in her was a calculus she may not have consciously made. She had given loyalty to Jackie and been excluded from the will. She had given protection to the Kennedy administration and had Onassis taken from her in return. The ledger of her unreturned investments in other people was long by 1977. She had learned to protect herself before she protected anyone else. What this closed off was the last arena in which she had been fully known. The capacity for the kind of radical honesty that the Capote friendship had required, the kind that lets someone see not your performance but your actual interior, that capacity did not reopen after 1977. Her later friendships, including the third marriage to film director Herbert Ross, which began in 1988, were warmer and more managed. She was still, universally, described as extraordinary company. But the quality of being confessionally, completely known, that was gone. She stopped finishing that particular sentence in 1977. She had been finishing it since 1962. Nobody connected the two things. The third change was the most visible and the last. By the 1980s, Lee Radziwill had found a way to be extraordinary that did not require fighting the weight. She poured her original intelligence. The eye, the warmth, the ability to organize a room of difficult people into harmony, into other people's work. Armani's events, Mongiardino's interiors, other people's parties, other people's brands, other people's aesthetics. She was not performing in these roles. She was genuinely, specifically excellent at them. But what anyone who had not known her before would have concluded, meeting her in 1985, was that this was who she had always been. A brilliant supporting presence, a woman naturally suited to illuminating others, someone at ease with a secondary role. They would have been wrong. They would have been meeting not Lee Radziwill but what the weight had made of Lee Radziwill. One thing the weight could not touch. Her eye. The specific, original visual intelligence that noticed what a room needed and knew exactly how to give it. The thing that had drawn Mongiardino to her, that Armani relied on, that produced homes admired in publications across 4 decades. It had F.O. Remed before the weight arrived. It had survived everything. The comparison, the stolen love, the silent marriage, the will that erased her, the obituary that reduced her. It was there on February 14, 2019, the night before she died. That the eye survived is the most important thing in this story. Not because it means the weight didn't win. It did win in every formal arena. But the eye's survival means the weight could not complete what it set out to do. It could erase her from the official record. Could not erase her from herself. August 10, 1999. New York Presbyterian Hospital. Lee Radziwill's son Anthony was 40 years old. He had been diagnosed with testicular cancer in 1989 while working as a producer at ABC News. He went into remission. In 1994, the year his grandmother Janet died, the year his cousin John Kennedy Jr. served as his best man at his wedding to journalist Carol DeFalco, he was diagnosed again, this time with sarcoma. He spent the next 5 years in treatment. Surgeries, chemotherapy, radiation. He worked through it. He lived through it. He and JFK Jr. remained, through those 5 years, as close as brothers. On the evening of July 16, 1999, Anthony and Carol learned that the small plane JFK Jr. was piloting had disappeared over the Atlantic near Martha's Vineyard. His wife Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and her sister Lauren were also on board. Anthony was in the terminal stage of his disease when the news came. According to Carol's memoir, What Remains, Anthony sat at the kitchen table, folded his arms to support his head, and cried. John was recovered from the ocean. So was Carolyn. So was Lauren. Anthony died 24 days later. Consider what Lee Radziwill was carrying in the summer of 1999. She had carried the comparison since 1947. She had carried the empty marriage for 15 years. She had suppressed Onassis in 1963 and watched Jackie marry him in 1968. She had helped Jackie through every crisis of her life and been excluded from Will in 1994. She had carried 3 marriages that ended. The prince, the filmmaker, the ongoing management of a life that had been made smaller year by year than the one she'd been born to live. She had carried the silence about all of it, the public performance of being unbothered, for over 50 years. She had developed, through all of that, a specific and highly refined competency. She could carry what was placed on her without breaking the surface, without naming it, without letting anyone see the interior of the load. She had carried the Onassis wedding with a smile. She had carried the exclusion from Jackie's will without a single public statement. She was, in the formal vocabulary of how other people described her, someone who always adapted to whatever the circumstance. That competency had been built on one assumption, that the weight came from outside her, that it was placed on her by the system, by birth order, by culture, by the choices of other people. The weight was external. She had learned at cost to carry external weight. Anthony was not external weight. He was what she had built when the system was not watching. Her son, born in Switzerland in 1959, raised in England and America, grown into a man who worked hard and loved his people and died too young because cancer is not selective about who it takes. His death was not a weight placed on Lee by the system. It was a loss that came from inside her own life, from the part of her life that had always been hers. She had no framework for this weight. It exceeded what could be carried. Not because she was not strong. She was in the specific and particular way that women who carry enormous loads for very long periods of time are strong. But because there is a category of weight that strength alone cannot address. Those who knew Lee in the years after 1999 describe something that is harder to articulate than any of the earlier changes. A quality of greater quietness. Not depression, not with Radziwill, not visible grief. Simply quieter. The surface she had maintained through 6 decades of systematic loading, the surface that had allowed her to stand on Scorpios in 1968 and smile, had, after the summer of 1999, grown still in a new way, as if the engine that had been maintaining it had found a different gear, and staying in that gear now was the work. She lived quietly for the last 20 years of her life. She remained a figure of extraordinary elegance in the worlds she inhabited. The fashion world listed her among the 50 best dressed over 50 as recently as 2013. Armani spoke of her with sustained warmth until her death. Her friendships were real and reciprocated. She died on February 15, 2019, at her home in New York City. Her daughter Anna Christina was with her. The cause was described as natural. Now returned to Scorpios. October 20, 1968. Lee Radziwill at the edge of a wedding reception. In something beautiful, holding flowers, smiling. A woman whose grief had been pressed into the shape of a smile, worn on a Greek island, at the wedding of the man she had loved, to the sister who had always taken what she wanted most. You know now what was inside that weight. The comparison from 1947. The cold marriage she called not true. The affair suppressed at the Kennedy administration's request. The 5 years she had carried that suppression with no acknowledgement. Then the call from Onassis, the invitation, the wedding she attended anyway because she was Lee Radziwill and she had been carrying things for 31 years and she was not going to stop now. She would carry it for 51 more years after Scorpios. She never named it. Not publicly. Not once. The weight left 3 things behind when it was finally set down. The first thing it left is in the record, and the record is specific. When Lee Radziwill died on February 15, 2019, the New York Times published her obituary. The headline read, Lee Radziwill, sister of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, D.A.S. at 85. Not Princess Lee Radziwill. Not fashion icon and interior design luminary. Not style legend who shaped the aesthetic of a generation. Not any of the things she had actually been, in her own right, across 8 decades of a life lived with genuine distinction. The sister of. She had outlived Jackie by 25 years. The weight had outlived Jackie too. It was still being applied in the formal record on the day she was buried, by institutions that had had 25 years to find a different headline and had never needed to look. The second thing the weight left is in the people who watched her carry it. Tory Burch, at the news of Lee's death, wrote, We are heartbroken and I will miss our dear friend. This was not a tribute to an icon or a historical figure. It was a person grieving a specific person. That distinction is what the weight left in those who loved her. The knowledge of who she actually was, separate from the weight, visible only to those who had been close enough to see beneath the surface she maintained. Mathilde Favier, a close friend and the public relations director for Christian Dior, said, She was the height of elegance, a true icon, an incredibly attractive woman who always adapted to whatever the circumstance. Adapted to circumstances. Not adapted to Jackie. Not defined by her sister. By whatever the circumstance. Favier used that phrasing deliberately. Truman Capote in 1976, when he still loved her before the lawsuit and the falling out, said something that contains the full weight of what was done to Lee Radziwill in 9 words. It was Lee who lived in the shadow of this super-something person. Lived in the shadow. Present tense. In 1976. 43 years into her life. 29 years after the pink dress at the coming-out ball. Still living in the shadow. Still carrying. He saw it. He named it. He understood that what he was describing was not Lee's limitation but her circumstance. The third thing the way T left is in her. What remained of Lee Radziwill, after Anthony, after the will, after Onassis, after 51 years of carrying what had been placed on Scorpios, was the same thing that had been there before the first weight arrived. The eye, the original, specific, unteachable visual intelligence. The warmth, the capacity to create harmony in a room full of difficulty. The husky voice, the humor. None of it had been given to her by her sister. None of it had been produced by the weight. It had formed in her before the weight arrived, survived everything the weight did to her, and was present until the last night of her life. That survival is the verdict on what the weight could and could not do. It could make her secondary in every formal record, could take Onassis from her, could exclude her from the will. It could ensure that her obituary named her sister before it named her. It could erode her trust in other people and redirect her intelligence into service rather than creation. Could do all of this, and it did. What it could not do was unmake her. The weight was enormous, and it was specific, and it was placed with the precision of a system that had decided, before she was old enough to object, who would be the subject of the story. But it could not reach the part of her that had formed before the story was assigned. The I remained, the self remained, diminished in its arena, yes, redirected, yes, but present. She should never have been asked to carry the name second. That single weight, being Lee Bouvier, a woman of genuine and original substance, and being made to preface herself with someone else's name for 85 years, would have weighed exactly as much as a full identity. Complete, specific, entirely her own. She weighed that instead.